Hello students! I enjoyed reading your responses in Lab 1 and now I want to give you a response. So we're going to go through the lab and I will clarify some things and point out some various things that you brought to my attention in your writing. So here we go. This right here, these are the learning outcomes. Only one person did this, but they actually defined these. And that is terrific. That is excellent practice, but you do not have to do that. That is not here in the student responses, which we'll look at later. So, just a note of clarification there. Alright, then in every lab there's a little outline right here. And essentially we did two things. So moving forward, one of these things will require you to complete a lab report. But for Unit 1, we did this more inquiry-based question and answer lab so that we could just get started gently, and I could also see what you were interested in. So, for example, many of you ask questions about the trees, and many of you live at altitude in the mountains. So I have a forest ecology lab, and I have one more lab to insert into this course. And therefore, I think I'm going to do forest ecology. And I would love to get your feedback on that after you watch the video. But this would require you to go out to an area, wherever you are, and look at two forests of different aspects, like north, east, southwest facing slopes. And if you like to ski or recreate in the mountains, you know a lot about this because the trees are on the north and east facing sides. There's a lot of good powder there, and then the south and west facing sides are more grassy and open. Alright, moving right along. So everyone seemed to grasp onto this, that at the bottom of this instructional document the responses are aggregated into student responses area, and almost everybody did that, so excellent. And you submit that to the Dropbox, and I always write comments, so please make sure you read my comments. Alright, so as we get to the first part, this was so interesting. You folks brought up some excellent nonprofits, and I'm working now to aggregate your responses into like a PowerPoint so I can share it back with you. But we had so many wonderful nonprofits represented, international ones, national ones, nonprofits from Colorado. And one thing that really stood out to me was that like the people who founded these organizations are really pretty amazing people. And I didn't even know that they were the founders of these nonprofits, even though I knew about all the nonprofits that you presented. So thank you for educating me on that, and I'm thinking about how we can incorporate some kind of biography into our work this semester. Alright, going down to this inquiry-based part of the lab. So this is my specialty. I really want this to be a student-directed course and focused on you discovering the answers, because that's what you do in your everyday life. So most people in the reflection noted that they felt a little uncomfortable, but by the end they really had learned a lot and felt that they understood why the process was set up the way it was. So thank you for that. So essentially we went through this question building process. As I just mentioned before, so many of you asked questions about trees, and that was neat. I didn't really think trees were going to arise as a majority concept. So I will incorporate that as we move on. And then, as we went down, we looked at the different variables. So I want to make some notes here. You know, I didn't correct people along the way, because this really is about discovery. But I do want to put my final spin on it to make sure we understand the science behind what we're talking about. So, most experiments are set up with an independent variable and dependent variable, and there can be multiple of each. But almost universally, the independent variable in ecology and ecosystem science, environmental science, is going to be abiotic factors. So thinking about that definition of ecology, the interaction between living and non-living components in the environment. So the independent variables are related to the environment. It could be water, soil conditions. It could be observational study in which you're looking at something outside that is just existing and you're measuring that, or it can be more experimental where you create an environment. And in a created environment, you can control more variables, but you cannot conclude that that is exactly how it is in ecology outdoors as nature intended it, because it's a completely derived environment. So most ecological studies start with an observational study and then lead to some kind of experimental study in the greenhouse. Now, the dependent variable is the biotic factor, the response. Okay, so one of the definitions of life is to be able to respond to stimuli. So necessarily, the variable that is dependent, it is responding to these environmental variables, has to be something that's alive. So most of you, asked to build studies that revolved around plants, and it would always be some parameter of the plant that would be the dependent variable, and a parameter of the environment that would be the independent variable. Okay, moving right along. Just a few folks wrote a question for the hypothesis. So you already wrote the questions up here. So just to make a hypothesis, you turn your question into a statement. And this statement doesn't have to be directional. It can be just yes or no. So, a difference in water temperature makes no difference to plant growth. Okay, so that's like, or you could say cold water decreases plant growth, and then you put directionality on that. So we'll get into those nuances more, but just a note right there. And then the null hypothesis is the opposite. So essentially, you always want to be testing your null hypothesis, because then in the scientific process and thinking about the ethics of science, if you are designing a study around what you don't expect to see, then you are not trying to prove yourself right. So the null hypothesis ends up being the central focus of the experimental design. Okay, moving right along. I was really impressed with your work here with the citations. I didn't expect folks to choose such challenging academic articles, but you really met the task. I was really impressed. Some people used web documents, and that's okay. I hope that we can all get to peer-reviewed literature by the end of the semester, but some of you are already there. So just a note, they're excellent work. And summarizing the methods, be sure that when you're writing words, you know what they mean. Some people wrote methods where I knew they were authentically written, but there were words in there that I didn't even know what they meant. So I certainly don't expect you to know. So ask questions if you don't know what is going on. Don't try to just skate through that. Let's get through those questions. Okay, and then you designed very interesting experiments. I really appreciated that. And then we went into part 2, where basically I just took you through basic instruction. So usually the labs are prefaced by, not like a textbook chapter worth of information, but just enough to get you started. And so I think the problem with our modern lab environment is it's really like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And that takes all the critical thinking out of it. And when you wrote to me in your reflections at the end, a lot of you pointed that out, that you felt like you had to do a lot of thinking, and that's why we're doing this, so you can really put your thinking caps on. So I wanted to clarify a few things. With the biology of plants, we are really talking more about ecology and ecosystem science as we move through the next few weeks. So, few points of clarification. A lot of people wrote in superlatives, so they would say something like taproots always grow in sandy soils. Well, that's just not true. You just can't make super broad generalizations like that. But you can, about the environmental variables, but you can make generalizations about the biological condition. So let's talk about the biological condition. So when we are talking about, just checking out my pictures. We'll stay on this picture. When we are talking about fibrous roots on the left here, this increases surface area. That always increases surface area. And fibrous roots are not as deep, right? So they just are really collecting surface water that falls as a result of precipitation. In contrast, the taproot has large biomass and it is a storage organ, as a few of you noted, but it is able to reach a more permanent water source, so put its foot in the water table. So, for example, the only trees native to the Colorado Plains, so anywhere east of the Rocky Mountains, are cottonwoods and willows, and they are called obligate phreatophytes. So obligate, they must. Phreato, water, phyte, loving. They must have their feet in water. And so essentially when we have riparian areas that are really separated from the river corridor because it's undercut, these plants do no longer have their feet in the water table, and that becomes a problem. So our riparian forests are really struggling because of that. But then, right there in the upland, in the grasslands, almost all grasses are going to represent, or all grasses are going to exhibit this fibrous root tendency. And that's because they are dependent on precipitation for moisture. They are not near water table, and they are not near rivers that might periodically flood. And interestingly, there are a lot of trees that are monocots. So let's take a look at this. Hold on one sec. So, for example, some trees that are monocots are palm trees, and they are designed to withstand strong winds. The fibrous roots really help to anchor these plants. And while we're there, let's just go on a quick tangent. Currently, Hawaii is experiencing unprecedented weather, 60-foot storm surges. Here's a video. And even the mayor of Honolulu is saying, beware people, climate change is coming. This is going to be happening more and more. The weather is going to be becoming more erratic. And while that's going on down on the coast, up in the mountains of Hawaii, it's snowing more than it ever has. So anyway, sorry for that tangent, but essentially we have trees and grasses exhibiting this fibrous root system, and when we think about adaptations for climate change, root structure is an important part of it. So as we move on, we learned a bit more about plant biology, and then I wanted to clarify these questions here. So you all understood this parallel to the horizontal or vertical plane. So let me tell you my side of the story. So grasses, think about the grasses here in Colorado. They capture the least amount of solar radiation when the sun is overhead. And this is by design. They conduct photosynthesis primarily in the morning and the late afternoon when it is not so hot. So when the stoma opens to take in carbon dioxide, water is lost. If this can happen in a cooler part of the day, then the plant conserves moisture. So that was a point that was a little, people's answers were really good. So then when you think about the broadleaf, most of you seem to understand this a lot better. That, in the tropical rainforest, one of the ecosystems that many of you described, the plants on the forest floor are broadleaf, and the leaves are very large. So an example in my own home would be peace lilies. I'm sure you're familiar with those. They have dark green, lance-shaped leaves, and they make this white leaf-shaped flower. So, anyway, understanding that the concept of the design of the broadleaf being parallel to the horizontal plane is to capture more solar radiation, because these plants live in environments that lack sunlight but have plenty of moisture. So opening the stoma at any time of day is okay. So those are just ways that we can think about those environmental factors. It really does often come down to moisture and temperature, which a lot of you arrived at when you're thinking in this lab. So let's talk about plant longevity. When we're thinking about plant longevity, there's high variability here in the responses. My take on it is that plants that can exhibit multiple reproductive strategies have the most advantages. There seem to be possibly a misunderstanding. Perennial plants still set seed, so they still get that benefit. But they live from year to year, so the parents don't die. And many plants like aspens or strawberries, spider plants, they are connected either with roots below ground called rhizomes or above ground called stolons. And so that's another way where the reproductive strategy is by vegetative means. Seeds are still possible. When you think about annual plants can only do seeds. So that is why perennial plants are usually more hardy. Most of the native plants in Colorado are perennial in both the grasslands and in the upland forests. So just keep that in mind, that these reproductive strategies are not mutually exclusive. Okay. So, at the end, I asked you to write 100 words of reflection, and of course, always that's the most exciting part for me, because I really want to know what you're thinking, and I'm glad that you, by and large, thought this was a successful experience. As we move into the labs, they will become more traditional, but I want you to use the thinking strategies you used here as we move on. Alright, thank you. Let me know if you have any questions.